Okay, you might have heard that little disclaimer as well. And Dr. Dynner, if you have any concerns about the recording, I just want to let you know it's going to go on a password protected site on our website, and we'll take it down within 30 days unless you have some concerns otherwise. And please let me know if that is the case. You should be able to see my screen right now. Charles, can you see that I have the agenda up on the screen? You can just nod your head if you can see it. Wonderful. Okay, my name is Debbie Long. I think most of you know me. I'm very happy to have you all here. I have a feeling other people will be joining us in just a couple moments. And as you know, our program is being recorded. Do we have any guests here today? Anybody who would like to raise his or her hand and let me know that you brought a guest or invited someone? I don't see any indication that we have guests, so it's all members, Dr. Dynner. I have just a couple of brief announcements before Dr. Dynner comes on screen with his program. As some of you know, I'm also a member of another organization in our community, the Holocaust Speakers Bureau. My area of interest in genealogy is Holocaust research, and I also do some speaking to civic groups. We're having a very special program on September 29th in Durham at what used to be called the JCC, or is now the Jewish for Good Center in Durham. It is a screening of the documentary Reckonings, which is about 75 minutes long, and it is about the struggle for survivors of the Holocaust to get reparations. I recently discovered, after years of doing genealogy, that my mother had rather robust files that were kept with several organizations that had to do with her application for reparations. And I also discovered that before reparations were even offered to many Jewish people, my mother actually sued the country of Germany over the building that was taken from her father in Lodz, Poland. So again, some of this information kind of overlaps with our interest in genealogy. I hope that you might find it an appealing program, and you can see on the screen that the URL for you to see the calendar, the event at the JCC, and to sign up is on the screen. It's at jewishforgood.org/calendar. We were also talking before we started that we had hoped that Barbara Friedman, Barbara, raised your hand and wave at us, that our president would be able to go to Philly. I know she's severely disappointed, but she had so many other commitments leading up to the conference that she was unable to attend. But I do believe we have some, at least one other member there, and I hope to get a report. You've never been to the IAJGS annual conferences. They are overwhelmingly wonderful in terms of the programs, the presentations, and the opportunities to network and get some personal interaction with people who are experts in genealogy. I am sure that some of the programs are being recorded and will be available, some for free, perhaps some at a cost later in the year. I also wanted to let you know that our next meeting is going to be a hybrid meeting at the Chapel Hill Library. We are going to have another Zoom presenter, Emily Garber. You may remember Emily from previous presentations. She's going to do one called Goodbye, Challenges Faced by Eastern European Immigrants. If you've ever wondered how in the world did your ancestors ever get to the ports in order to sail to the United States, how did they purchase passage? How did they know how to get from their shtetl to the ports? What kind of help did they get along the way? And I think all of us have those kinds of questions somewhere in our background. I hope you'll be able to attend that meeting either in person at the Chapel Hill Library, where we can watch Emily together as a group, or by Zoom. We're going to try to pull off another that should be hybrid meeting. Would anybody like to add any additional announcements or items of interest for the rest of us before I turn this over to our esteemed treasurer, David?
I'm unmuted. You're going to put the report on the screen, or you don't have it?
I am. Give me just 1 second, David, and I will do that. Again, the good news for Dr. Dynner, our guest, is that we have chosen a very good treasurer. He is not related at all to Bernie Madoff. So we know that our
Well-
funds are there. There you go, David. Take it away.
Although Bernie Madoff lived in our neighborhood for a while.
Yes, he did. I believe.
Butner Prison isn't far from Raleigh.
Yes,
So
but
he was,
that's the only connection we have to Bernie Madoff, I believe.
right. So the report hasn't changed much in the last couple of months. We just had a few expenses, some office expenses. We haven't added any new members. This past month, we have 64 members, and we have a bank account of $3,659. And so we're solvent, and not that much more to say.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions for David about our funds or the state of our treasury? David, you know how appreciative I am that you are handling our monies. If I had to handle one more thing, I don't think we would be in as good financial shape as we are right now. Go ahead, Barbara.
Oh, okay. So 2023 members is 60. Is that the right year? 2023 at the bottom?
Okay, let me
Or
put
should
that
it be
back up on the screen.
2024?
That's the right number from last
Okay.
year.
Thanks.
Who would like to ask an additional question? I don't hear any. So I am going to introduce our speaker. I think you all know from the various emails I sent out that I am really excited to have a scholar of Dr. Dynner's caliber with us. We don't often have historians or scholars with us. Most of us are genealogists, some of us more expert than others, and that's usually who we have as a guest. But as you can see from Dr. Dynner's bio, and I presume you wrote this, Dr. Dynner, or your mother, because it's a very flattering bio.
I don't think I wrote this. And actually, I'm currently at Fairfield University, just so you know.
Okay. You're not at Sarah Lawrence College any longer?
Yes, small detail.
Okay. Well, thank you for that correction. You can also see he has an illustrious educational background himself, having received a BA from Brandeis, an MA from McGill, and his PhD from Brandeis again in 2002. And his interests are primarily in Polish, Yiddish, and Hebrew sources on the Jewish social and religious history in Poland. He's also specialized in the Hasidic movement. For those of you who like kind of a celebrity background for our guest, Dr. Dynner appeared on Who Do You Think You Are? And he got a chance to work with Gwyneth Paltrow. That's very exciting. She's got Jewish ancestry. And he's also consulted on the Rashida Jones and Bernie Sanders episode. I believe that Bernie Sanders turned out to be a cousin of Larry David, and they do look alike as well. I've been fortunate enough to read both of Dr. Dynner's books. If you haven't had an opportunity to do so, I have to tell you they are so good that they are basically kind of tough to find at a price that people would describe as affordable. There are a lot of resellers out there who are asking for all kinds of money for Yankel's Tavern, which is my favorite book. There are some parts of it that are excerpted. I gave you a link to some excerpts, and you can take a look at the index, which will be very helpful. I love this book because my fourth great grandmother was a tavern keeper in Skierz, Poland. And if you're interested in the Hasids, Men of Silk is also an excellent resource book. And again, you can find portions of it available on Amazon and other kinds of sites. Yes. Okay. Okay, he just reminded me that his Aunt Judy makes a good brisket, and I can't think of a better lead-in than that. So, Dr. Dynner, if you'll go ahead and screen share and take it away, we're all anxious to hear what you have to say.
Okay, thanks so much. I should also mention my newest book, which is called The Light of Learning, and it's about Hasidism in a later period at the the eve of the Holocaust, as the subtitle suggests. And it goes into the Holocaust period as well. So if you're interested in Hasidism for that later period and how unfortunately the whole community was destroyed and then kind of reemerged in America and other centers, you might be interested in that. But today we are talking about economics. And I always worry that economic history might be a little dry and technical. I find it actually fascinating. I'm going to make the case for why it's so important and interesting. First of all, Jews are really invited into Poland, which becomes the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, because of their economic promise, not because anybody especially liked them. In fact, there was a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment, but the nobility realized that in order to settle and build their towns and cities, they could do worse than having Jews settle those areas, because Jews had a reputation for business acumen, for literacy, for sobriety, and other stereotypes, which sometimes, maybe even often, were verified through daily contact. So economics really is the key to the Jewish admission into Poland, really in the beginning. Well, it's the Middle Ages. It starts pretty early, but in large numbers in the 12th and 13th centuries. And that's really where Polish Jewish history begins. Um, there's also another side to this, and that is it really helps explain why Jews are tolerated and why they're considered so important, too important actually to attack for many centuries in Poland, at least from the perspective of the nobility, because there's a kind of symbiosis, meaning Jews contribute something economically, they provide services and goods, and in return, the nobility will protect them from violence. And they'll tax them, but not so heavily that they drive them out. So it's an interesting kind of reason for tolerating Jews, in addition to inviting them in the first place. There's also a flip side to this. Jewish economic success becomes a reason for resentment. And this is not only the peasants, this is Christian townspeople, and eventually small and larger nobility. As the nobility declines, they increasingly resent the role of Jews in the economy, especially their prominence in really lucrative kinds of pursuits like tavern keeping, which is going to be our real highlight here. And that resentment is kind of why economics is always a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's kind of a form of self-defense, ensuring protection. On the other hand, it can be a cause of violence and boycotts and other kinds of resentment. But this is the way Jews in Poland and probably most of the diaspora really survived for many centuries in the absence of a polity, in the absence of a state. Now, this was really at the heart of Jewish existence. If you look at this painting, which is a late 19th century depiction of a rural area, small town or village, somewhere in the Polish-speaking lands by Chmielmoński, whom we'll talk about in a minute, you will see this symbiosis in practice, where to the left side of your screen, you'll see Jewish traders. They seem like they're petty merchants, peddlers maybe, and you'll see also looks like it might be a Jewish musician in the tavern, and you see peasants dancing. It seems to be a kind of a holiday, a Christian holiday, because they're in their best clothing. And what's also important is what is not seen in this painting, which is inside. If you enter the tavern, which we'll see in a few minutes, you would most likely find a Jewish tavern keeper, and he would be leasing this tavern from the nobleman who owns the land. And that's the arrangement for many, many centuries. Jews lease the taverns from the nobility who owns them. And that's an important aspect, too, of this relationship, because it virtually makes these taverns fireproof. Nobody is going to burn down a tavern that belongs to the nobleman, even if it is leased by the Jewish tavern keeper, whom everyone blames for peasant drunkenness, for peasant indebtedness. and all kinds of other vices. At the end of the day, this belongs to the nobleman. I don't think any historian has ever pointed that out, so I really want to emphasize it. It makes the tavern fireproof. Also, what's unseen here, very important, is Jewish artisans. Jews were also involved in the crafts, in various crafts, but very heavily in kinds of artisan pursuits that affected Jewish religious observance. Butchers, because of kosher meat. Clothing, because of shatnez, the prohibition against mixing wool and linen. So these were very prominent among the crafts that Jews pursued in Poland, and that's pretty constant. And another very, very important thing that overlaps, often people also engage in this on the side, is money lending. Jews are lending money at interest, usually around 20% seem to be the rates, and you'd get in trouble if you charge more interest to the peasants and to the nobility and even to church officials, clergy, even bishops. Now, why are Jews lending money? Well, everybody knows that Christians were prohibited from doing this. Unless they weren't prohibited from doing this, there were many exceptions to that too. There were, of course, banks, but Jewish credit was much more readily available. It was preferred by the nobles because Jews were a vulnerable, dependent group that could really supply them with money anytime they really needed it. And perhaps there's not the same urgency to pay them back if you have power over them. But most importantly, in my mind, is Jews are not allowed to own land in most cases. What that means is the normal thing you do with your profits, which is to buy more and more land, so you increase your estates, meaning you increase your status, your prestige, you buy titles to nobility, and so that's not open to Jews. So really, in a way, it becomes kind of blessing in disguise. Jews cannot own land, so they will put their profits to work. They will lend out whatever they make, or at least most of what they make. This provides another layer of security because nobody wants to see their source of credit be hurt or killed. And no, this could work different ways. Sometimes you don't want to pay your money back, so it can also be dangerous. These are all sort of double-edged swords, but more or less, these economic pursuits are what allowed Jews to flourish for many centuries in Poland. And why things begin to break down is going to be one of the themes that we discuss. But just to give you kind of an overarching view of the most important pursuits, what I would say, based on the available evidence, is in the beginning, most Jews, when they enter Poland, are entering as really traders, meaning merchants and moneylenders. And as time goes on, the tavern keeper becomes more and more important. And leaseholding also applies to other areas too. The leasing of tolls, for example, on roads, the leasing of mills where you grind your flour. These are all leased out to Jews on the states because the nobility doesn't want to deal with it themselves. They're ensured a steady profit. Jews who lease a tavern or mill will pay a lump sum, and they get to keep anything they make over that themselves as kind of profit and lend it out, of course. As time goes on and the liquor trade becomes increasingly under pressure and even banned according to the law, for many reasons, as we're going to see, mercantile pursuits get the upper hand. Jews are involved in trade more and more by the end of the 19th century and into the interwar period. But as Jewish merchants are increasingly boycotted and attacked because of this desire to Polonize the economy by the newly independent Polish state in the wake of World War I, crafts are going to get the upper hand. So at the very, very end of this period, right before the Holocaust, you're going to see more Jewish artisans than you do merchants because it's simply safer to be an artisan. And mercantile pursuits are becoming less and less lucrative, and you can really get bodily harm by running a stall or a store. And that's kind of the story of Jewish economic pursuits in Poland. And I want to emphasize again that double-edged sword, right? It's a kind of, we can call it economic self-defense, which ironically can be the very cause of anti-Jewish behavior, including outright pogroms. It's a paradox, but it does seem to work more or less until, of course, it doesn't work during the Holocaust. And this is a major cataclysmic event, which is going to cause everybody to reassess everything. Some, opting for other countries with capitalism like America, some opting for the state of Israel, which is the triumph of Zionism and Jewish self-determination, and some opting for communism in the Soviet Union. This is going to be a divided kind of a community as a result of this trauma, not just from the Holocaust, but also earlier than that from pogroms. Okay, but by and large, economics is at the heart of why Jews settle in Poland, why they survive and thrive in Poland, and then why they're really attacked and ultimately murdered. So I hope that sets everything in perspective. And now we're going to go into details. First of all, Jews are invited into Poland initially and officially in 1264. They had settled as merchants earlier than that, but they get the first charter for acceptance by Boleslav the Pious. And one thing you'll notice about the statutes of Boleslav the Pious of Kalisz, 1264, is that many of the protections that are promised Jews in order to attract them to settle in these Polish areas is that they'll be protected from danger, from violence, and if you're going to take a Jew to court, you need to have Christian and Jewish witnesses. You can't kill them. You can't damage their cemeteries and synagogues. You can't force them to abrogate their Sabbath observances or festival observances. And most importantly, no blood libel accusations. Now, I'm very sad to say that there were blood libel accusations. For those who don't know, the accusation that Jews use the blood of Christian children in their rituals, a kind of reenactment of the crucifixion, if you will. They did happen by the early modern period, really every couple of years. But they didn't often result in executions. This is something that, was always a danger that could be negotiated and helped, often with the use of not just lobbying, but bribes. This was considered perfectly acceptable to bribe the secular authorities to do their job and protect Jewish communities. And again, that goes back to the economics. Money lending emerges as a major pursuit in these statutes. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 relating to pledges on security on a loan and trade. Okay, and just to read this, just gotta minimize these boxes here. Wherever a Jew travels through our realm, no one shall place any barrier in his way, nor cause him trouble or harm. But if he is carrying any goods or any other property, tolls should be paid by them at all the places where tolls are levied. If a Jew himself cannot pay the toll which he owes, one of the citizens of the town in which the Jew is staying at that time should pay. So it gives you a picture of traveling Jewish merchants throughout these lands already in the mid-13th century. We also have coins that were discovered with Hebrew inscriptions. And that suggests that Jews were involved in the minting of coins. Look at the upper left-hand corner. That's one of the clearest examples of Hebrew writing. And it seems that if you mint the coins, you get to determine what's written on them. And that seems to be what was happening here. Casimir the Great is another major leader who's lauded for his acceptance and tolerance of Jews. He mainly affirms these various statutes. but he adds a few, and he's considered so sympathetic to Jews that a legend emerged that Kazimierz had a Jewish mistress named Esterka from Esther. And that's why she used her feminine wiles to seduce him into reaffirming privileges and offering new ones to the Jewish community. Poland-Lithuania, as it comes to be known by 1569, is really the breadbasket of Europe. So what the main pursuit economically is in Poland is the grain trade. That means it's a very heavily agricultural country that's going to be exporting its grain throughout Europe. And Western Europe in particular is buying its grain from the Polish nobles who own the vast majority of land, and they will float their grain stocks up the Vistula River out of the port of Gdańsk or Danzig, as it comes to be known later, and they will export it throughout Europe. This is really at the heart of the noble economy, this grain trade. Jews are involved only peripherally. They're not really allowed to engage in the grain trade. They're going to engage much more in secondary pursuits, like forest products, for example, wax and honey and I guess timber, furs, these kinds of things, but they will be allowed to lease out space on these barges that are going up the Vistula River. Poland is partitioned at the end of the 18th century in 3 stages, and the green portions go to Tsarist Russia, the orange-yellow portions go to Austria or Habsburg Empire, that's known as Galicia, and the blue portions are going to go to Prussia. In terms of population, it's around, could say, 600,000 are in the green areas in Tsarist Russia. The Habsburg or Galician portions are more like 250,000 Jews, and the Prussian areas have around 50,000. The rye exports, and most of this grain is rye, have been declining since the 1650s, but they really are going to drop with the partitions of Poland because it costs more eventually to export your grain in terms of the travel and the tariffs and the tolls and everything than you could ever make a profit on it. So most of that grain is going to be turned into alcohol, vodka, as they call it. This means that Jews who are leasing these taverns and distilleries as well are going to become increasingly important to the nobleman's estate economy. Merchants remain important as well. In fact, in this period, it's a time of great flourishing for international merchants who can also lease the state monopolies, especially in the Tsarist Empire, in Warsaw and other areas. And these are prominent Jewish merchants, some of the most prominent, Shmuel and Yudita Zbitkover, there should be an and there between the two words, Barak and Temeril Bergson. What's interesting about the Bergsons is they become main patrons of Hasidism, this mystical movement. But Yudita, who's on the far left, becomes a patroness of Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. These Jewish merchants become a very, very important part of underwriting manifestations of Jewish culture in Poland, whether it's Hasidism or Haskalah or other pursuits as well. Yet, it's the tavern keeper who becomes iconic because the tavern keeper is much more than a tavern keeper. In the smaller towns and villages in particular, what we would call the shtetl, the Jewish family is going to become actually crucial to local life, not just supplying leisure and vodka and entertainment, as we saw in the first painting, but also advice and loans and supplies. he would mediate weddings, he would mediate funerals in some cases. At least they would occur in the church, and then everyone would migrate into the tavern, and like almost an anti-priest, the Jewish tavern keeper would preside over the ceremony in the tavern. And it's an amazing thing how integrated into the social fabric of local small town and especially village life the Jewish tavern keeper becomes. So you have a kind of a symbiosis emerging. And as a result, Jews become sort of a major part of Polish literature. And even the tavern itself in this Mickiewicz description is kind of described as a Jew. He's described as looking like a Jew with his beard and his gabardine and his tzitzit that go down his body. It was Sunday, and from church after morning mass, they came to Yankel's to drink and relax, and everyone's cup gray vodka swished. Round with a bottle the barmaid rushed. Yankel the tavern keeper stood in their midst. And you realize as you read these narratives that there is a kind of interethnic cooperation going on within very specific prescribed roles. Jews are the tavern keepers, the peasants are the customers, Jews are also the musicians often. And the nobleman who's not seen here is probably off somewhere in Warsaw, another big city, gallivanting and throwing balls and so on. But he knows that he's got a steady source of income thanks to the various leases on taverns. And he can withdraw whatever the Jewish tavern keeper owes him from the lease gradually as a kind of bank machine. Anytime he needs cash to pay workers, to throw lavish balls and so on, he comes to the Jewish tavern keeper and demands another portion of the lease payment. He doesn't get it all at once in most cases. Here's another image of the tavern. You'll see Jewish musicians off to the left-hand side, and on the very right-hand side, the Jewish tavern keeper and his wife. And you saw in the other picture as well, the Jewish tavern keeper's wife is just as important. Often she's the one who's serving the customers. She's the one giving advice to the women of the village or the town. And there's an old Polish peasant saying, when in need of advice, go see Sarah. And Sarah was, the Jewish tavern keeper's wife. Here's another example, and we can see how violent Jewish tavern keeping could be, with the Jew in the background there looking kind of bewildered as there's some sort of dispute or disagreement, and someone's getting hurled to the ground there. So these are very, very rough places to be trying to make a living. And especially if you look in the background, you've got your wife and children there. This is not exactly domestic bliss, but it provided many, and probably most Jews, with a living. If we have to estimate, it's definitely over half of the Jewish population that's involved in tavern keeping by the end of the 18th century. And then you have all kinds of situations where Jews will turn their own house into a tavern temporarily around Christian holidays, for example. Bialik, the great Hebrew poet, was himself the son of a Jewish tavern keeper. And he records in this poem that I translated here how unsettling the whole experience was. Silently I stood between his knees. This is when he's a child, my eyes hanging on his lips. Drunks rumbled around and drinkers sated themselves amid vomit, all these liquid metaphors, monstrous faces corrupted and tongues flowing with invectives. The walls shrank from hearing, the windows hid their faces. Only to my ears alone, the ears of an uncorrupted child, did the holy lips of his father spout and gush a secret whisper, a whisper of Torah and prayer and words of the living God. So he's getting his Torah, probably Bible or Talmud lessons, in the middle of this tavern, while everyone else, of course, of the dominant culture is getting drunk and partying. And this really instills in Jews a kind of sense of superiority because they, the dominant culture, are drunks. We study Torah. It's a sense that, even though we're a minority, we're vulnerable, we're disparaged constantly and even, violently assaulted. We are the superior ones because we don't behave like this. We study Torah. They just drink and, dance and act crazy. And so it's a kind of, you could call it a cultural self-defense here. This is very much rooted in economic pursuits. The problem and the beginning of the breakdown is really the 19th century when the technology makes the liquor, the vodka, more and more potent and cheaper. And this basically helps turn Poland into a country of drunks, especially the peasantry, who have a miserable life. I should have mentioned before, they're serfs for the most part. That means they're virtual slaves, forced to drink in their nobleman's tavern on monopolistic terms to any profit they might manage by selling off their produce or something goes back to the nobleman by purchasing the nobleman's liquor, which was really the only kind of pursuit that you had for leisure after a long day of working the nobleman's fields for free in most cases, sometimes as much as 4 days a week. And so drunkenness becomes a major problem, what today we would call alcoholism. And these are poignant pictures. Social reformers really did point to an actual societal problem, widespread alcoholism, but they blamed the Jewish tavern keeper. And here you see in the background, there's this satanic looking tavern keeper now. It becomes a weapon against Jews because they are blamed for the drunkenness. Even though the nobleman owns the tavern, nobody thinks much about that. It's the Jews directly selling the liquor and getting the peasants drunk and driving them into ruin. And this becomes a major theme in anti-Semitic literature. So there's a huge effort to drive Jews out of the liquor trade throughout the 19th century on the logic that if you get rid of Jewish tavern keepers, you'll get rid of alcoholism, which of course anybody who looked at areas where Jews don't live throughout Eastern Europe would know they're all getting drunk there too. One bureaucrat I found throughout all my archival research pointed this out, but everybody ignored him. This whole notion of Jews remaining sober while the Christians are getting drunk, I have to mention as a scholar of Hasidism, is absolutely absurd. Jews were getting drunk too, increasingly, because the Hasidic movement, with its ideals of worshiping God in every activity, every pursuit, even dancing, storytelling, drinking alcohol, feasting, and so on, this develops a kind of maybe the most robust culture of drinking in the entirety of Jewish history. And this is happening at the same time. So what we really have is kind of the Hasidic movement engaging in alcohol consumption behind closed doors, in Hasidic spaces, in Stieblech, in their prayer houses, but not in view of members of the dominant culture, Christians. So they're able to sustain the image of sobriety, which is why the nobles keep rewarding them or awarding them with tavern leases. So it's a very interesting thing that's kind of happening. Publicly, Jews are sober, privately, not so much. And here we have a depiction from Holodersky of a Chassid and his wife, and I circled the bottle that he's holding. This becomes a real kind of trope in depictions of Hasidism. They drink, by the way, for religious purposes in their own explanations. Taking a shot of whiskey is called a tikkun, a cosmic repair. You do it to toast somebody's somebody's accomplishment of perhaps a wedding, a birth of a child, and so on and so forth, the commemoration of the death of a great Hasidic leader. There are all kinds of reasons for taking shots, but they're given this religious rationale. But in reality, Hasidim are getting quite drunk. And there's even a Haskalah, or enlightenment-based satire against Hasidism for finding every excuse to take a drink. Now, we should look at maps for a second, because by the 19th century, most Jews really are living in either the Russian Pale of Settlement or the Kingdom of Poland, which is off to the left, the shaded portion. I'll show you in a second. It looks a little bit like a tea kettle, that bulge at the end, and Galicia, which is not shown very well on this map, but that's Austrian Poland. Here's a better look at the Congress Kingdom of Poland. And there, because of its legacy under Napoleon, which before it became the Tsarist-dominated Kingdom of Poland, it had been part of the Napoleonic Duchy of Warsaw, there were efforts to drive Jews out of the liquor trade that seemed to be working by simply requiring Jewish tavern keepers to pay a liquor concession. And they would just raise the price of the concession year by year. So according to governmental data, the number of Jewish families engaged in tavern keeping really began to decline precipitously, from over 17,000 down to 2,000, and then they project the last two. And it's assumed it's going to go down to nothing because they keep raising and raising and raising the concession fees. In reality, what I found is that Jewish tavern keeping continues to flourish. It's just underground, so they don't have to pay the concession fees. And that's a very anxiety-provoking lifestyle, but it's really the only way that a lot of Jewish families are able to survive, is underground tavern keeping. And it really becomes an open secret. Everybody seems to know, except the Polish officials at the very top, who, when they discover, they become outraged and drive the Jewish family out of town or out of the villages. Now, how did they pull this off? They pulled this off by simply installing Christians to run the taverns and directly sell the liquor, while they would do everything else associated with running a tavern. They did this with the full knowledge and complicity of the noblemen and all of the Christian customers. This was a little bit based on the logic of the Shabbos Goy from centuries earlier, where you would have to install a Christian to run your tavern on Sabbaths and holidays. And there was legislation for how you could do this according to halakha, or Jewish law. So this experience of having Christians run your tavern on Shabbat translated pretty easily in having them run the tavern as a kind of a front when it became gradually illegal or too expensive because of the concession fees. And I found this really interesting case where a nobleman, had three different villages in which Jews were running his taverns after it was outlawed in 1841, and has to go before the Tsarist officials of the Kingdom of Poland and explain himself. I won't go into the case too much, but what I do want to look at is his rationale. He's asked to explain, why do you continue to install Jews as tavern keepers despite it being against the law? And he answers, as an owner of a roadside village who must always consider the convenience of travelers, I could not neglect to hire Jews who would continually provide for the needs of traveling Jews. So here he's talking about Jewish merchants who need a place to rest on the Sabbath, to eat kosher food, perhaps to share news, and maybe even gain customers. But then he goes on to say, most importantly, people of this faith, the Jews, show themselves to be sober. And this work requires sober and suitable people. And for this reason as well, I hired Jews. I tried with all my might to fulfill the will of the regime by not having Jews live there or actually sell liquor, meaning they weren't directly selling, right? It was done through a Christian front. And so he thought he was really complying with the new regulations. That economic reality is also reflected in the testimony of another nobleman. But before I get to that, I just want to point out that that when the investigation ensued and the tavern keepers were being expelled, 10 local Christians signed a petition in which they promised that this Jew in question in this one village, I guess whom they really liked, was not selling liquor at all. They swore to it. They offered to pay a bribe to the police and everything, a gift as they called it. And they would vouch that this Jew never sold them liquor. And in that way, they stood up for the local Jewish tavern keeper, which is interesting and ironic because this village is very close to Yed Vabne, which exactly 100 years later is going to be the scene of a major massacre of Jews by their Polish Christian neighbors. So you see how much has changed since then. It's thought about 1,600 Jews were murdered by their Christian neighbors in Poland under Nazi rule, but most of the perpetrators were Poles. In fact, all were direct perpetrators were Poles. This became a huge controversy in Poland because Poles had always thought of themselves as victims of the Holocaust too, and now you see them as perpetrators. It's still controversial to this day in Poland, but not as much, thankfully. In any case, the point is that things really, really changed by the 20th century, and we want to try to understand that breakdown. But before we get there, I wanted to show one more really interesting archival testimony by another nobleman. The unwarranted expulsion of the Jew from my residence, this is a Jewish tavern keeper, has caused me annual losses of 1,000 zlotys. This is a violation of my right, to the full use of goods on my lands. In addition, the area is a trade hub for the county, and the loss of a cheap Jewish restaurant hotel, as he's calling it, will inconvenience Jewish merchants by depriving them of a place to sojourn on the Sabbath. By eliminating the village's sole hospitality enterprise, the government has greatly impeded local trade. So you see that symbiosis is not only between Jewish tavern keepers and local Christians, but also a symbiosis between Jewish tavern keepers and traveling Jewish merchants. Now, at this time, mid-19th century, there's another fascinating and important phenomenon in the Polish Jewish economy, and that is the rise of Jewish industrialists, really merchants who become industrialists, especially in the city of Łódź or Lodz, where there's a flourishing textile industry. There's also railroads, and both of them get involved in railroads as well, but it's really textiles. Thanks especially to the production of cotton, that several Jews like Poznański and Kronenberg become fabulously successful and wealthy. They create massive factories that have incredibly lucrative output. Here's a palace that Poznański lived in. And in terms of the profits that they're making, we see that they increase year after year after year, the number of looms enlarging in Poznański's enterprises. This is a spectacular success story, yet it's very, very few Jews who managed to make it big in the textile industry. So we shouldn't really think of the Jewish community as wealthy. Unfortunately, in the eyes of anti-Semites, you only need a couple of examples, and it's seen as the entire community being wealthy and unfairly so, exploiting the workers and so on and so forth. So once again, we have this double-edged sword of economics providing a degree of security and prosperity, but also endangering the very Jews who it's protecting. Now, what I want to go into, and see, we're we're getting towards an hour mark here, is this trove of petitions that more common everyday Jews wrote to this Rabbi Eliyahu Gutmacher, who was known as the Tzaddik of Grodzisk or Gretz, because they would most often describe their economic pursuits as part of their petitions. They're asking the rabbi to intervene in heaven to pray on their behalf, and it's often about parnasa. And those who read Hebrew can see in the very first line there, at the very end, it says lahatzlacha for success, v'la parnasa for livelihood. So this is a very typical petition. These are what they look like. They can be difficult to decipher, as you see in the overlay image. But I just want to point out what a rich source of economic history this is, because it doesn't only look at the wealthy industrialists. It looks at everyday Jews and everyday life and their interactions with Christians. So what we find, and this is before this period of time, in 1843, this is what Polish Jewish occupations looked like, with 28% of Jews involved in crafts. Tavern keeping was only 9.7%, but remember, that's only legal registered tavern keeping, right? It's not all the underground tavern keeping, which was probably more like that 25% you see there, who are pretty unaccounted for. And you have trade, which is a very small portion. I'm skeptical of that one as well. But I did my own counts of the Guttmacher petitions, and I came up with something a little more realistic. And that there you see in green, trade is the largest category. This is by the 1870s. Leaseholding, mainly of taverns, there are 152 of them, and artisans are 167. So you see the proportions are starting to change by the 1870s. And then by 1897, according to official statistics, the Jewish involvement in trade is large. It's really the largest, but crafts are very, very close behind in the purple. And it looks like tavern keeping, which isn't even accounted here, is probably in the red mostly. It's a very small proportion. Now, from these petitions, you have many tavern keepers, as I pointed out, in the 1870s. Here's an interesting one that points to the Jewish-Christian symbiosis and the use of Christians by Jews to run their taverns as fronts. Reb Zalman ben Gitzel, the homeowner, which is a term for a wealthy Jew, who is known as a great host and philanthropist. I observe the holy Sabbath, and the great merit will stand with me when the great Sabbath comes. And I will prepare for the Sabbath and festival this Thursday. I have a tavern and take care of things with 3 goyim, who are my right hand. One who lives there has the name Lipinski, the other is Kwiatkowski. It may be that I misread Tzvi is dry, but so it could be 2 goyim or 2 Gentiles. But the point is that you have Christian tavern keepers who are being prayed for, right? Who are being asked to the Rebbe, the Tzaddik, the miracle worker, is being asked to actually pray for their protection, which is a fascinating phenomenon. What changes is 1861, beginning in that period, emancipation of the peasants. And so now you have competition, and peasants themselves want to set up their own taverns. And you see this reflected in some of the petitions. Menachem Moshe ben Fega for success in the tavern and to repel the Gentile from there who arose against the Jews and took their livelihood, so that the customers will not go to him, and that the scent of his drinks will stink, so that they can no longer stand his drinks, and to cause his downfall. For all the Jews and the widows and the orphans need this, for he took their livelihood. And this is really a kind of humorous request to curse the Gentiles who are competing with him by opening up their own taverns. Now, what happens at the end of this kind of inter-ethnic economic struggle, in addition to other factors like the rise of nationalism, for example, and really, really, you could say ethno-nationalism is a better description of it, is the outbreak of waves of anti-Jewish violence called pogroms. And the nobility has declined at this point by 1881, where they can no longer be the protectors of Jews. So it's a real shock to the Jewish communities of Eastern Europe. But what they find is they're virtually defenseless now, because the nobility themselves has gone deeply into debt. Many have given up their estates and sold them and moved to cities where they too are in competition with Jews. The Jewish communities are increasingly vulnerable by the end of the 19th century. 1903 to 6, especially as a result of the 1905 revolution and the granting of new rights for Jews, over 3,000 deaths. Those are the infamous Kishinev pogroms and that whole wave. And then 1919 to 1921, over 100,000 deaths, accompanying the Russian-Ukrainian Civil War, where Ukrainian troops especially are responsible for murdering really thousands and thousands of Jews. This is the area of pogroms. And just to kind of summarize my argument, I would say the most important reason for pogroms is the decline of that Jewish-Christian economic symbiosis that I've been talking about, where the nobleman wants to protect Jews on his estates who are leasing out his enterprises, where the Christians who are peasants don't dare attack Jews because they'll face the wrath of the nobleman, and where you essentially have a kind of mutually beneficial arrangement. Peasant emancipation is going to break down that whole symbiosis because peasants themselves become competitors now with Jews, and then nobles too become competitors of Jews as they are forced to sell off their estates. So the decline really end of that symbiosis is going to be, in my mind, the single most important cause of anti-Jewish violence. Jewish tavern keepers are still to be found in the interwar period. Here's a photograph that's part of the Ansky collection of a Jewish tavern keeper. And the eyes are what really impressed me, in this photograph. There's a certain kind of despair, but also a real toughness there. And increasingly, Jews are moving into trade. Do you see on the left? And, you have women, especially running market stalls and also stores, and crafts, artisanship, which becomes more and more popular among Jews as anti-Jewish boycotts make trade more and more uncomfortable and even dangerous. The creation of independent Poland was by and large great for Jews, because they were emancipated fully for the first time. They could now own land, for example. They could participate in government and form their own political parties and vote, and they were technically free. The problem is there were all kinds of government efforts to drive Jews out of the economy in order to Polonize the economy. This was seen as a sort of patriotic duty to make more and more Christians get involved in trade so that they weren't dependent on this supposedly foreign element, the Jews. So that Polonization of the Polish economy involved attacking Jewish economic niches by simply nationalizing entire trades, including the liquor trade, by charging extra taxes and fees to Jews, by really all kinds of restrictions and payments on Jews alone that Christians were not responsible for. So this was really a Polonization of the economy that spelled disaster economically for Jews. They would have gone under completely had it not been for American aid, especially through the Joint Distribution Committee, which would kind of keep these Jewish communities alive. And their strategy was try to retrain what they called Luftmenschen, mainly petty traders like peddlers and like market stall sellers and so on, to retrain them as artisans, which was seen as less controversial for Polish nationalists. You know, that was the way this whole thing kind of existed in the interwar period. Taxes and restrictions and fees and nationalization of Jewish economic niches on the one hand, driving Jews into unemployment, and yet there were all kinds of aid mechanisms by American Jewry, including there were small loan associations, but also there's outright cash that's given, especially in the wake of anti-Jewish violence. Now, Jews are on the one hand pressured to become Polish, on the other hand prevented from becoming Polish because of all the restrictions I talked about. They tend to respond by forming their own kind of subcultures, especially socialist, Zionist, and Hasidic, and other Orthodox as well. This is expressed politically, but it's also culturally and educationally. They each have their own school systems, and you have the emergence of kind of a divided Polish Jewish community by culture, by religious sort of observance and affiliations, and especially by politics. In the middle of the interwar period, the Jewish economic distribution is still considered abnormal in the eyes of most Poles, right? You see the blue is trade, that's 36% are involved in trade. You see it's gone up in the crafts, 42% now are involved in crafts. And the general population in the green is agricultural still. Still by 1931, most Polish Christians are farmers. So that's the same kind of age-old relationship that the Polish government's trying to change. Now, if you look at it more closely, Jews versus Christians, Jews form a huge proportion of merchants. 52, that's over half of Poland's merchants are still Jews, and a much smaller percent are in crafts, which is probably why it's less attacked by anti-Semites. But there's a sense, that this is humiliating for Polish nationalists. It's humiliating that we can't become merchants ourselves and run our own economies. And what happens is the development of right-wing nationalist, ethno-nationalist groups, Stronnictwo Narodowe, Obóz Narodowy, Radykalny, which is even more violent, attacking Jews, boycotting Jews, especially anti-Jewish boycotts, and actually attacking Christians as well, who try to purchase from Jews. And they're telling their listeners the current regime, which itself is not anti-Semitic, will collapse. A nationalist regime is coming. The new regime will expel Jews from Poland. There will be no more unemployment, and Polish workers will at last find work. Seen as kind of a sum-zero game, right? You can't have Jews and Poles participate in the economy. We have to push out Jews in order to succeed ourselves. And here's a very vivid kind of illustration in a Polish anti-Semitic publication called Kalendarz Samoobrony, which means the calendar of self-defense. This is what they considered boycotts and anti-Jewish violence as a form of self-defense. And they're kicking out this Jewish, very Hasidic-looking Jewish person, and the sign says, "To Palestine." And the message is, Jews go back to Palestine, which is rather ironic considering the political rhetoric of today. Pogroms have gradually emerged in 1935 with the death of Marshal Pilsudski, who had really protected Jews and didn't tolerate anti-Semitism to a large extent. They're not as terrible as prior pogroms that we've talked about. The death toll is around 50, which is still bad, of course, but Most importantly, I would say it's two reasons. It's a terrible trauma. Number one is psychological. Poland had been considered a safe haven. And in 1935, recall that the Nazis have come to power in Germany, and their rhetoric is annihilation of Jews. The Soviet Union was very anti-Jewish in a religious sense. Right? You could remain as Jews, of course, but you have to give up religious observance and practices. Poland had been seen as kind of a haven, despite all the flaws, all the injustices, all the discrimination. The government was going to protect you, and now suddenly the government can't or won't protect Jews. I even turned up documents in which the police in central Poland, especially, are being ordered not to protect Jews who are being attacked by mobs. The police will simply embarrass themselves if they do that, because the mobs will overcome the police and kind of profane the uniform of the policeman, is some of the language that you see. So Jews are really left unprotected by the state in some cases, and it's an increasing sense of urgency. There's a famous song that comes out of these pogroms um, called called "Is Brent," Our Town is Burning, by Mordechai Gebertig, which argues that our town is burning and we need to stand up and fight. And Jews do form self-defense units. Zionists and Bundists especially begin fighting back. The problem is sometimes self-defense can actually inflame the situation and even cause a pogrom. Violence is a very unpredictable thing. The Hasidic and Orthodox Jews prefer the old way of going behind the scenes and bribing secular officials to basically do their jobs, police chiefs, governors, and trying to influence them that way to protect the Jewish communities. It's a very dangerous and upsetting situation. And as I mentioned before, the American Jewish communities are monitoring this very closely, and their solution is capitalism. Send money to rebuild pogromized communities, to rebuild themselves, but also to retrain Jews as artisans, which is, as I mentioned before, less inflammatory, right? Less controversial for Polish nationalists. And so that's a big effort of American Jewry to try to be constructive in this situation and protect, but there also will protest in front of, the Polish embassy and all kinds of um, uh, sort of spiritual and philosophical protests going on that put pressure on the Polish government. And the Polish government does seem to put an end to these pogroms virtually by 1938. There are very few pogroms after that point, at least that we know about. So I think I'll stop here, and I'll take any questions. Anything anybody wants me to elaborate on, I'm happy to talk about.
I'm going to ask everyone to feel comfortable to unmute and also put questions in chat. Dr. Dynner, I am astounded at the illustrations and the documents that you found. Where is this stuff? You must have gone to Poland, I would imagine, to find a lot of the documentation. And I'm wondering also about the art.
Most of the documents are from Poland. Now, increasingly, in a sense, unfortunately, these documents are being scanned. They're available online, but it's really important to go to Poland. So I go to Poland pretty much every summer. COVID was a little different, but the point is sitting in the archives and going through these documents, not knowing what you're going to find, is one of the most exciting things anybody can ever do. You forget to eat, it's just so hours go by like minutes. You're just going through these documents, and what you look for is patterns. So the way I came up with the very topic of the book, Yanko's Tavern, is because so many documents had to do with the Jewish tavern keeper who, according to historians, had ceased to exist, right? Because they looked at the legislation. They didn't see what was going on underground. So one of the things I really want to emphasize here is the documents themselves allow you to challenge narratives because you see what's really happening based on complaints and protests and court cases and everything else. The literature and the art is another really, really important source for contesting these narratives, which say that, there were no Jewish tavern keepers after it was outlawed, because the painting themselves tell the whole story, right? You see all these taverns that are run by Jews. And so, either everybody's lying and making something up, or the historians had gotten it wrong. So this book was a kind of intervention, asking historians to take the legislation less literally and to look at all this evidence that points to a flourishing underground Jewish liquor trade. The paintings are available online. Chalmoinsky is the one artist that I showed a lot of paint. He was really known in the 19th century of depicting scenes of everyday life. So he's really, really helpful. Especially he would sort of go out into the countryside and, paint the scenes that he saw. And there are just so many Chalmoinsky paintings of taverns and tavern keeping that you really see it was at the heart of rural life, especially.
You say that you go to Poland frequently and you go to the archives. Is this in Warsaw or in a number of different cities?
Warsaw has an incredible amount, but I would go out in the provinces, and Lublin's an amazing archive too, and Kielce has a great archive. So if you have the time and the resources, you can get a lot done in Warsaw, but it's great to really go to these regional archives because that's where you find all this rich material. A lot of it was centralized, but much of it is not centralized. And it's also more fun to work in the regional archives because it's a little bit more laid back, and what you get is just maybe something that they didn't consider important enough to bring to Warsaw, but is very important for what you're doing. So, that's the experience that's made this all so thrilling.
And I take it you read Polish, Hebrew. I just can't imagine. I imagine you're fluent in Polish in order to understand what you're looking at. Is that correct?
You really do need to learn Polish because it's also a matter of deciphering the handwriting, which can be challenging. This is the time, mostly before the time of typewriters. So, but you learn how to do it, and driven by the passion and excitement of the whole endeavor, you learn the languages you need. I had to learn Yiddish too. Some of these you learn passively because it's not so easy to have spoken Yiddish in this day and age. You don't have like a normal linguistic community. So my Yiddish is more passive, more like reading level. My Polish is good, but it can always improve, and it gets rusty the longer I am away from Poland. My Hebrew is pretty fluent, and other languages as well.
I wish my parents who spoke 8 languages between them, had raised me to be at least bilingual, but they felt that to be a real American, I had to grow up speaking English. And now, of course, much to my regret, I'm a little bit too old to learn a language as tough as Polish. Karen also asked a question about some of the archival material you found. She wants to know, how do we have access to the Guttmacher petitions? And Karen, my guess is you must have a very personal need to know the answer to that question. So feel free to unmute if you want to. She says no. Okay.
So these are available in the YIVO archives in New York. There's a whole nother part of the collection in Jerusalem. As I heard, they're being scanned, so they should be available online at some point. But for now, you probably have to go to YIVO, which is located in Union Square in New York City, and request them. I found that the majority were actually written in Hebrew. I came across a couple of Yiddish ones as well, which is the one I quoted from. But really, it's Hebrew mixed with Yiddish and Slavic languages as well, but you can really read most of them if you can read Hebrew. I think the reason why I was the first person to really work with these is everyone had assumed they were in a very difficult Yiddish with Yiddish handwriting, and that is true sometimes, but most of the time it's actually you can really read this stuff, especially if your Hebrew is really good.
Karen, did you have a follow-up question to that? No. Okay, Barbara does though. Barbara?
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the mention of Jews and Judaism in the Polish court documents you showed us and some of the government documents. I don't think I had ever thought that it would be in documents, it would be proclaimed by the government, but you know.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely the the main reason why Jewish tavern keepers are in so many documents is they keep getting in trouble because they're doing something that's illegal, right? Which is running a tavern or not paying their concessions, whatever the case may be. So the logic is that if you're reading about it, it's because it's not supposed to be happening. And that allows you to really challenge the reigning narratives. As I mentioned before, the Jews were kicked out of tavern keeping. You know, it's funny because you will have very good government statistics showing that they successfully drove all Jewish families out of the liquor trade, and they'll put zero as the number of, but then you go a few more pages and you'll see a whole investigation. Jews are selling liquor everywhere throughout the countryside. A little bit of a contradiction. I tend to believe the latter.
Yeah. And some of those early rulers who were protecting Jews, back 1600s era, that's fascinating to me too, because you sort of don't expect it based on what we know about Poland after 1890.
Right, and that's so that's the nobility. Now, it's really important to understand that with the partitions of Poland, the nobility is locally still the authority, but they're no longer the main authority. In other words, you have a kind of a federal government, so to speak, in these partitioning powers, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, and they might be at odds. The Polish nobility doesn't like interference by the state on their own properties doing something they've done for centuries, which is to install Jews to run their taverns. They might not like it, but ultimately the czarist authorities have the supreme authority, so they can be very much at odds. That's why you have this collusion happening between Polish landowners and Jews and local peasants. It's because they want to continue on the way things have been for centuries. They don't want the czarist officials interfering. And there's a fierce sense of pride that we have the right to do things that we've always done. And there's a real feeling that if I don't install Jews, I'm not going to make money. The peasants are going to drink up all the product. If I install Christian peasants in the tavern, they're going to drink everything. So these are the kinds of prejudices and maybe even realities that are causing nobles to actually ally themselves with Jewish tavern keepers rather than with the Tsarist or Habsburg authorities. This is going to change, of course, with peasant emancipation and the decline of the nobility towards the end of the century, which is why, as I've argued, the Jewish community has become much more vulnerable.
They may be Jews, but they're our Jews.
Yeah, that's sort of the attitude, and they're also money makers, right? Let's not be too pure about it. I don't happen to like Jews, but they ensure a steady flow of income, from my various enterprises.
Was Bialystok a needle trades city? Do you know?
So that's okay. So I mentioned Łódź, but after Łódź, by the end of the 19th century, Bialystok is going to be an incredibly important textile industry as well. The problem there is Jews are unable to get training in mechanized textile pursuits. So all the mechanized jobs are going to Polish Catholics, and Jews are stuck doing what's called piecework, which is hand needlework in their own homes with their entire family employed. It's an awful existence, hours and hours and hours, from early morning till the nighttime, just furiously working at this piecework. Whereas the Christians were actually getting preferred jobs in the mechanized trades because all the trade schools were in Polish. And they also could work on Saturdays. So this was a huge disadvantage, which is why you have this creation of a really impoverished Jewish working class, which is going to drive emigration out of Poland. That's one of the things that's going to drive it.
We have a grandfather in our family who was a tailor when he got to Philadelphia, and he was from Bialystok. And he was also colorblind, which is an interesting phenomenon.
But you do have a kind of a John Henry phenomenon where the Jewish, peace workers are trying to compete with these machines, and it's just a hopeless situation that only gets worse.
I have a question from Roz. She wants to know if you have information also about what was going on in Austria-Hungary. She writes, my great-grandfather had a tavern or a general store in what was then Austria-Hungary. I thought he owned the land. Is that correct, or did he also rent from the nobles in that part of the world?
Galicia or Austrian Poland, it was also a leaseholding system. It was rare for Jews to own land, but they would lease the tavern and they would get a plot of land adjacent to the tavern that they could grow their own food on. That did happen to a great extent, and sometimes they would even raise pigs because the pigs could be fed on the waste from the distillery, from the distilling process. So it worked out as a kind of like inner symbiosis in that respect. The temperance movements in the Galicia and Habsburg areas was pretty strong. Where peasants, gained the right to organize politically and have their own parties. And so these temperance movements aimed at diminishing drunkenness and increasing peasant productivity and sort of dignity, that had a negative impact on Jewish tavern keeping. So there are often complaints that I've come across of Jews complaining that there's a temperance movement in this town and it's losing its customers because the peasants aren't drinking as much, And you see, it's one of the sort of unfortunate aspects of this whole symbiosis, which is that Jews are really pressured into entering this alcohol trade, which they probably know deep down is very harmful to the peasants. And yet there aren't too many other economic options, especially considering how overcrowded trade is and how difficult it is to break into the crafts. So, this trade does decline. It's probably for the better. Nobody seems very happy with running a tavern. This diary I found from the daughter of a Hasidic tavern keeper from around World War One. Her name is oh my gosh, I'm blanking on her name. It is Eula Wald is her name. It's also located in Yivo. She writes throughout her diary accounts about how miserable it is running a tavern. She has to work in her family's tavern. The customers, flirt with her and harass her, and it's just she's acquired some culture. She goes to a Polish school, and the happiest moment in her life is she marries a Hasidic lawyer, which is surprising to find, and she's able to leave the whole tavern life behind. So this was not a life that anybody really desired. And by the interwar period, which is when she's writing, it seems that there are increasing opportunities for Jews not to engage in this very kind of dangerous and dirty pursuit.
Now, can I
Russ,
just
did
ask
that
a
answer
quick-
your question?
Can I just ask a quick
Sure.
follow-up about, ownership in Galicia? I know that my great-grandfather paid some kind of taxes in order to operate his store. which was actually part of his house. It was attached to the house. It was not a separate building. But I may have been wrong all these years, thinking that they sort of own this store and they own the house
Oh,
and
it's
they just
possible.
pay these taxes. But is that
It's so let me be clear, you know, by the interwar period, which may be when they were talking about when you heard the family stories or testimonies, by the
early late 1800s, early 1900s? Yeah.
so early 20th century,
Yeah.
it became more possible, especially because in Galicia you had emancipation much earlier. It's not full emancipation, but it's virtually emancipation as early as 1867. Then you have a much easier time acquiring land. There are all kinds of impediments or obstacles to owning land because everybody was afraid that the Jews, with their legendary wealth, are going to buy up all the land and virtually own Galicia or own the Kingdom of Poland. So it's the kind of stereotype of Jewish wealth that caused everybody to throw every obstacle they could in the way of Jewish land purchases. But it did happen, and it increasingly happened as you get into the interwar period. So it might actually be an accurate family story. But in the earlier periods, for sure, it was almost unheard of for Jews to own the tavern and to own the land. I found only 5 cases of Jewish land ownership in the Kingdom of Poland, you know, in the 19th century. So it's pretty rare in that respect. Galicia was more lenient though, more tolerant.
Thank you.
We have a comment from Richard Kramer, just picking up on what you said about the piecemeal needle trade. He said it carried over from for the Jewish immigrants to the United States from Eastern Europe. Is that pretty much in line with what you found?
The whole question of carryover is an interesting one. You would expect there'd be a lot of carryover. You know, if you make this arduous journey to the new world, you're going to use whatever skills you have in order to start anew. However, the reality seemed to be that there wasn't as much carryover as you would expect. You know, people would engage in whatever economic pursuits they could find. Now, a lot of pursuits were closed to Jews in America, especially new immigrants, but gradually you find might call a normalization of Jewish trade. This could be taking different forms. Prohibition provides an enormous incentive to get into the liquor trade because it's so lucrative. It's also dangerous. But you know, prohibition was an exceptional situation. It didn't last forever, of course. And so that's why during prohibition, you find Jews getting into the liquor trade, especially in Canada, because in Canada it's legal, you know, so you can engage in the production and sale of liquor, like the Bronfman family, for example, even though they were tobacco farmers. So that's you know, they realized you couldn't grow tobacco in Canada so easily, at least not in the areas where they had settled. So they got into the liquor trade. So yeah, it really didn't necessarily carry over. And what we can think about instead is the simple entrepreneurial skills, the ability to run a small business. That is a pretty flexible skill to have. You know, you have bookkeeping, you have literacy, of course, and arithmetic. That that gives you an advantage over other immigrant groups and allows you to kind of work your way up, regardless of the thing that you happen to be selling or getting involved in. And if you've been loaning money back in the old country, you know, the same thing would apply in the new country. So really, you know, I would say it's not as direct a carryover as you might expect, but it's a carryover in terms of just basic skills, accounting, even thrift, you know, the kinds of mentalities you need to succeed in business. You know, you really do have an advantage over other immigrant groups. I would put literacy as the most important of those.
Fascinating.
I was actually
Richard.
seeing more of the needle trade though, because in New York City, didn't Jews were very prominent in that in their own homes. The tenement houses had, you know, they'd be in their own rooms or whatever.
Often you have the sweatshops, of course, where and that was a huge trade for Jews who were new immigrants, and if they didn't have those skills, they would learn them for sure. I mean, that was what was available, but again, that's determined more by what's available than the fact that you happen to be a tailor. I mean, I imagine you could work much faster than everybody else if you were a skillful tailor and you wind up in one of these sweatshops, and that was probably recognized, and that probably allowed you to be promoted. The interesting that's really captured well in Hester Street, an amazing film that everyone should see about this immigration period, is it was the world turned upside down. Suddenly being a tailor made you actually more valued and having a higher status than a Torah scholar. When you because what could a Torah scholar do to make ends meet? And that's captured pretty well. So it's something that you probably know, but I should emphasize: artisanship or crafts were low status in the old country, in Poland. They were lower status. They become increasingly important in the 1920s and 30s as Jews are being driven out of trade. But I would say the stigma kind of remains. When you get to America, you do what it takes. But even there, I mean, how many Jews do you know today who are tailors? It just was something that I think in Jewish society, the crafts were not considered as are not considered as high status as things now, of course, it's the professions, but back then it was mercantile pursuits and other kinds of things that required more literacy and perhaps allowed you more time to study, which is also another side to this.
I was struck by the illustration you had, or I guess it was a photo of Poznański's home, his palace. My mother was from Lodz, and so I've seen it. I've seen the place, his grave, which is really a monument. It's unbelievable. As I recall, the Poznański Palace has been turned into a mall. Is that
Well, I
correct?
hadn't heard that. I'd heard it was a museum. So
Maybe it's a museum. Okay.
Yeah, because it really is a beautiful palace that he constructed in the middle of Lodz. I'd be surprised if that happened, but I suppose anything's possible.
I'm probably mistaken. I think you're right. It's a museum, but one of his other factories was turned into a big mall, as I recall.
Got it. Yeah. Yeah, I haven't been to Łódź in years, so anything
Okay.
could have happened since I was there last.
You recommended Hester Street, which is a great little film. I'd also like to recommend a film that was very controversial in Poland called Aftermath,
Yeah.
which is kind of a spin on what happened in Jabavne, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
It's actually Jedwabne,
Gedvadne?
Wabne with a B.
Wabane. And if you like movies, I would encourage you to see this one. It is about a man in Chicago. As you know, we have a lot of Polish people in Chicago, and he hears that his brother is in trouble in this small little village in Poland. And so the brother travels back and discovers that the brother has been taking the stones that are being used to fund a road through this village. He's been taking those stones. He discovers that there's Hebrew writing on the stones and realizes that these stones come from an old Jewish cemetery. He's taking the stones and he's creating a new old Jewish cemetery out of them, out of respect. And it's a terrifying look at the relationship between Poles and Jews today, as well as the history during World War II. It's a film that really stayed with me a long time.
And I think it's really important. What I've tried to emphasize today is it wasn't always that way, between, Jewish and Christian relations. That's what's so strange and tragic is just a century earlier, you had local Christians vouching for the Jewish tavern keeping, preventing him from being expelled, not because they like him, but because he's useful. He's useful for local life. and maybe the nobleman ordered them to do so. But the point is how things really change so rapidly, and we should think about Poland not as just one vast Jewish graveyard, but actually as a place where for centuries Jews had been able to flourish. They were at least relatively secure and prosperous, with some major exceptions, relatively secure and prosperous. That's why you had so many Jews living there to begin with. And then end of 19th century or turn of the 20th century, it just breaks down, and it comes to a tragic end in the Holocaust.
Can you give us, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but could you give us a little bit of a kind of a trailer or a teaser about the next book you're writing? What do we have to look forward to?
So, all right. So hold on. First of all, it's out. So this is it. It's called The Light of Learning, and this is about Hasidism on the eve of the Holocaust, but also during the Holocaust. I do talk about economics in this book as well, but the focus is, of course, on the Hasidic movement. And basically, what I found is there had been very few Hasidic yeshivas before World War One. The movement during World War One was considered almost defunct, with the youth fleeing and becoming Zionists and socialists and assimilated. And Hasidism rapidly rebuilds itself through a kind of educational or pedagogical revolution. They build hundreds of yeshivas. They create a whole school system for girls and young women called Beis Yaakov. And by reorienting themselves as a movement of study, and specifically Torah study, they have a revival right before the Holocaust. So it's kind of like a almost tragic flourishing intellectually before life comes to an end in the Holocaust. But even during the Holocaust in ghettos, I've turned up numerous yeshiva bunkers and Beis Yaakov bunkers where Hasidic youths were studying down to the very end, and people would just bring them food. So it's a pretty amazing story, that I uncovered again in the archives and other sources that went against the narrative. The narrative had been, basically the decline of religion, and the secularization narrative. And I found that really Hasidism revived in the wake of World War One. So that was my controversial new book, which I haven't had reviewed yet. I've received a lot of great feedback, but mainly from Orthodox Jews who really like this story, So I'm sure there'll be plenty of pushback as well.
Could you repeat the title of the book for me?
Yes, it's called The Light of Learning: Hasidism in Poland on the Eve of the Holocaust.
All right, I'll put the main title in chat. Would anybody else like to take advantage of Dr. Dynner's rich, robust life of the mind? I'm just so envious of your ability to articulate your research, to come up with these interesting theories and to present them in such an articulate and fascinating way. Okay, Barbara.
You talked about literacy as being a reason that Jews were able to run businesses and so forth. What percentage of the Polish population was literate over time?
So it depends on how you define literacy. If we're talking about Yiddish, it seems to be the vast majority. You would have to learn reading and writing in the Cheder, in the Jewish primary school. And that doesn't necessarily mean Polish literacy, but by the interwar period, Jews were required to learn Polish as well, either by attending public schools or having 2 hours of secular education in the Aguda or Hasidic schools. The point being is that you always have more literacy than the surrounding societies. To give you an example, in the 19th century, literacy among Christians was some as low as 4%, and that was mainly nobles. And the Jewish literacy, depending on which language you're talking about, was probably the vast majority. Hebrew literacy, to give you an idea, was more like 25-30%. But Yiddish literacy was way beyond that. So we just don't know because nobody counted Yiddish as a language. But it was very high. It seems like it was almost universal. You had to know how to read and write. It was a religious obligation. Now, because how could you possibly do your prayers and learn Torah if you weren't literate? That translates, of course, very well into business practices. Now, we have, I was told, several CEOs in the audience here, so I hesitate to comment on the importance of literacy in business, but my instincts tell me it could be pretty important and give you a real edge.
Okay. Who else would like to ask? Let's finish up with one more question. And by the way, Dr. Dynner, I just put publication information where members can buy your book, and I'll also put that in our next newsletter. I also added information. I was mistaken. It is not Poznansky's Palace, but rather the shopping center was in a manufacturing center. It's called Manufactura in Lodz. Beautiful city, actually. Who else would like to add one more question? Well, Dr. Dynner, thank you again for sharing your Sunday afternoon with us. Barbara and I were chatting a little bit back and forth privately. Just, I'm fascinated by this history, and it's really given me a great deal of insight into my fourth grade grandmother, and what a challenge it must have been for her to be a female tavern keeper way back when, and also some of the circumstances that led to the background of my Polish family. Thank you very much. Let's give him a round of applause, everyone. I know we don't usually do that in academic circles, but you certainly deserve our thanks and appreciation. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Wonderful talk.
Wonderful talk.
Thanks.
Okay. If you would like to, if you're working on a research project, I know Liz is working very hard on a family project. If any of you are would like to share some of your research with us, or have maybe a question to ask, this is a great time to do it. Otherwise, we'll be meeting again in October, as I mentioned, to hear a talk about how our ancestors actually made it to the United States or other places from their shtetls or other places of residence. You're getting some thank yous also in chat, Dr. Dynner. Okay, folks, I'm going to go and rescue my husband, who has been dealing with a toddler and a little one. He's probably at wit's ends. I wish you all a wonderful rest of your Sunday, and we'll be in touch. I'll send you a link to the video and a summary sometime in the next couple of days. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Debbie.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, David, Norma, Rusty, Karen, Michelle, Bob. Thanks again. Bye-bye. And Dr. Dynner, Dr. Dynner is left. Okay, thank you all very much. Bye-bye.